Hi everybody, Grandad back again. And what am I up to? Well, I'm doing another little video on seashells because when I did my previous video on seashells, I couldn't find some of my specimens. But since then I've discovered them, and so I'm able to show them to you now, and we can have another little recap. Now, one of the shells I mislaid was this one, and it's another conch shell, but it's a lot smaller, but it's really pretty. I mean, the light, I think I got the light a little bit better today, but this is a really beautiful shell. It's got all ribs inside, and as I say, you can hear the sea when you're listening to it, and it's got these knobbles on, so it's a sort of what they call a conch, and it's a little bit smaller one than what I showed you before, but it's a lovely little shell, and I've had that a long time. This belonged to my parents, so this shell has been around for well on 100 years, I would imagine, because my father owned it, and it was always about our house, and it's in beautiful condition, and so that's a really old one. Incidentally, on that other film I did, I couldn't remember that strange white piece of stuff I showed you. Well, I've remembered what it is now. It's actually a cuttle shell. I don't know why I couldn't remember cuttle shell, but they call it a cuttle shell, but it's actually the actual backbone. It's not the shell of the animal. It's the backbone that's inside the animal, and so they call it cuttlefish. The cuttlefish is the fish that it comes out of. It's a sort of a long, funny fish with tentacles out the front. And that piece that you show, the cuttlefish bone, is actually its backbone. So I wanted to put that right. Now, another shell as I've got here is this one, and this is called a nautilus. Now, these are very strange creatures. I mean, they float about in the sea up that way, I believe, and they have a door on here. And again, the door opens, and the cuttlefish with its tentacles would come out at the front here. Now, these are what they call nautilus or nautiloids, and they still live today, but these were prehistoric type animals. I mean, they're very pretty colours, all stripy, and they're found in very deep seas. So this is a nautilus, and they're a member of the nautiloid family, of which I've got another one here, which is a fossilized nautiloid. And it's a very pretty one, and these must have been really brightly coloured in their day. You can't see that terribly well on this one. I don't know if I wet it a bit, you might be able to... Sorry about licking on it, but when you wet things, or blow on things, the old trick of blowing, that makes things show up a little bit better. If I can get the light on it a bit more, you might see it even better. This is a fossilised They sometimes refer to them as ammonites, which they do have ammonites, but there's goniotites as well, and there's nautiloids. There are sort of various different kinds of shape like this, and there's lots of them. Now, another type of shell, which is very popular with people, and you see it around quite a lot, is this one. Now, it's a very flat shell. It looks a bit like an oyster, I suppose. But these come from the Philippines and places like that, or Hawaii and all that sort of place. And these are what they call abalone. Now, apparently, I've never tasted an abalone, but they're very tasty, and they use them as food. And they've got all holes along the side, which I think is where they breathed. I'm not sure whether they were breathing holes or what those holes along the side were for, but they've got holes along there. And the inside's got some lovely mother of pearl. I don't know whether you can see that lovely mother of pearl. And sometimes, when they get these big abalones, they polish them. They polish the outside to get all this white crustacean off. And when they polish them, they look very pretty. This is one that's been polished. It's a little bit broken, unfortunately. But you can see the holes quite clearly now, where it's been polished through. And I'm not quite sure what those holes for. Might have been something to do with the breathing. But these polished abalone shells, and they refer to it then when it's polished like that as Powie shell. And so Powie shell is They use it for jewellery, and it's a sort of a mother of pearl, but it isn't a pearly white. It's got all these iridescent colours, and it really is pretty. And unfortunately, I broke this one. I must have dropped it somewhere, and it's got broken. So I just keep it inside the big abalone there, which is a slightly different species. But you can polish them up and make them nice. Now, another thing that you find in the sea, which I wasn't able to show you before because I didn't know where it was, is this one. Now, this is a very strange. They sometimes call these dollars, but they're actually sea urchins. And this one has been very cleverly painted with a lovely design on there. And that's a really pretty shell, or sea urchin as it is. It's got 5 holes through it, and it's very flat. And I don't know why they call these dollars, but they do. They refer to these as dollars. And they've got like a funny pattern on the bottom there. I don't know whether the camera's picking it up. I hope it is, because it's very interesting. And a very interesting shell it is. But that one's been painted. But more often than not, when you find sea urchins, they're more like this. Now, this is a sea urchin. And it's got a hole in the bottom where the animal would come out and feed on whatever. And there's lots of different types of these. You can get small ones and different sizes. I've got some tiny ones that are fossilized, which I didn't bring in, but I could have brought a smaller one. And they look sort of really different. And you can get some with long spikes on. They have long spikes sticking up. And those are really interesting. But they get these, and tourists buy them. And again, it's a shame, but they probably, I don't know, I think you can eat these. I think people do actually eat the contents of these shells. But it's a pity if they actually kill these animals just to get their skeleton and sell it. It's a real shame that, but I mean, these things happen. People in poor countries, maybe they have to have have to make a living. So maybe selling pretty shells is a good thing. And of course, I buy them, so I'm to blame as well. Now, this one's a really pretty shell. I bought it somewhere, and I think this one's been polished. I'm not quite sure whether you find it in this condition, but it certainly doesn't look as if it's been in the sea for, because it looks like, to me, like it's been polished. And this has got a really nice polished surface on it. And I'm not quite sure what kind of a shell it is. It could be some sort of sea snail or whelk. I'm not quite sure. But it's certainly a sort of a gastropod of some sort. And it's been polished all over, and it looks really pearly. And that's another really pretty shell. And you can't resist buying one of those. Now, this is another one, which is a conical shaped shell. And again, I think this has had a little bit of polishing. It's not quite as shiny as the other one, but I think what somebody's done is smoothed it off. They've got rid of any crustaceans that were on the outside to make it more desirable and prettier. And again, it's got an interesting little hole there at the bottom where it came in. But that's a very pretty little shell, a little conical shell. Now, another one I've got here. Oh, incidentally, that's another nautiloid. And these are, this is stone, so it's a fossilized seashell. But these are ammonites, I believe this one is. This is actually an ammonite. I should have showed it in line. Now, this is another pretty shell. It's a bivalve. Unfortunately, it doesn't open, this one. I don't know why. I think they've glued it together. I'm not sure whether it was ever apart. But it's light, so I don't think there's anything inside it. But you see, it's been polished on the outside. And it's made it really pretty. I mean, again, you can't resist buying something like that when it looks so pretty. It's got a sort of a purpley sheen to it. But somebody must have polished the outside and to get rid of all this. Because when you find them in the sea, they're covered in this sort of crustacean all over. And so you're not going to find them as shiny and pretty as that in the sea. But somebody's took it and cleaned it up and polished it. And it looks really nice. And again, it makes a nice ornament. Now, I've got a lot of fossil sea creatures, which to make this video a little bit longer, because I made a mistake, I brought them in. Now, this is a seashell, which is very similar to that one I just showed you. And it's got a bit of a bump there. That's not natural. That's happened after it's been fossilized, I suppose. It's caved in a little bit. But you can see that this was some sort of big sea creature, big shellfish, that opened and closed, a bit like that big one I showed, like a clam. Because it's millions of years old, it's lost some of its shape. But what exactly type of one it is, I don't know. But it's certainly very interesting and very heavy, because that's now turned to stone. So it's a fossilized seashell, but still very interesting. And now another one, which is more of an oyster, and I showed this one of my previous videos. This is an oyster that's fossilized, and I actually managed to split it open, and you can still see the creature inside. And it's all turned to stone, but that was some sort of flat. It may not have been flat. It's been flattened by time and nature, but it may be like an oyster that is flat. I don't know, but that's it. Now another thing I said that I'd got, which I couldn't find at the time when I was doing the other one. I didn't manage to find the seahorse. I don't know where that is. I may still come across it. I don't know. And if I do, I'll show it on perhaps another video as a little ending. Show the seahorse that I've got somewhere. But this is the crab. I managed to find the crab. Now this is what I mean. They set these creatures, and you can get bugs and all sorts of things. I've got a whole set of bugs, which I may do a video on. I don't know. That might be another video of bugs. And what they do, they set all these creatures in resin. Now, it's interesting. I find it interesting. But again, it's a shame if they kill the crab just to put him inside here. It's a bit not very nice, but you very often don't find a crab in one piece. If you find him washed up on the beach, he's nearly always been pecked by something, and he's not in one piece. So I rather suspect, unfortunately, that this was a living crab that somebody's killed simply to put it inside this glass, which is plastic actually. It's resin. But it makes it interesting from my point of view, because I like looking at things like this. And you can see all the bits and pieces of the crab, and all his legs and all his feelers, and upside down and round about. Now, if you picked one off of the beach, obviously it would fall apart and be very smelly. So putting it inside this resin is not a bad idea. The bad idea is the fact that you kill a living creature just to make it into an ornament. Now, I've got some more corals here. This is another little coral that I discovered, and it's very pretty. I mean, corals are absolutely wonderful. And this is a little button coral. Now, corals come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And I've got this one here, which is what they call a horn coral. Now, this is a fossilized coral. So it's been turned to stone, but it's what they call a solitary horn coral. And it would grow on its root at the bottom here, off the bed of the sea. And it would grow out like that, a bit like a mushroom. And it would grow like that. And therefore, that's a little coral. Now, you get seashells. This is a modern, probably, seashell. And this type of seashell, without having to look in my book, it's known as a tarantella. And I think it's a tarantella because it goes round and round. And the tarantella dance is a dance where people go round and round and round. And this shell goes round and round and round and round. And it's a long, pointy thing. And so that type of shell, I think they call a tarantella. And you can get fossilized beds of this tarantellas, and they make them into tables and all sorts of things. Now, this one is a fossil. In fact, a little bit of fossilized something's just dropped out of it there. I don't know what that is, but it's something out of the sea. I don't think it's anything particular. I think it's just sand. But this is another tarantella, as I think I showed on one of my videos. And this is a fossilized one. This is about 40 million years old. No, perhaps I'm exaggerating there, and I don't like telling lies. I think it's probably 40,000 years old, not 40 million years old. Probably about 40,000 years old. But it's still very much a shell. It hasn't turned to stone, but you do get them as stone, but which is tarantella, which is totally turned to stone, and that probably is millions of years old. This probably isn't quite that old, but one of the reasons I want to show you this, you see that little hole there? Now, most of these shells that you find, and there's another little hole there beginning, it hasn't gone all the way through, but that little hole, strangely enough, has been caused by something like this, which is a sea urchin. And sea urchins will land on, small ones, will land on seashells, and they excrete from their bodies an acid, from their stomachs presumably, because we've got acid in our stomachs, which I think is hydrochloric acid, and it's quite strong, and it digests our food. Well, sea creatures have the same thing. They've got acid in their bodies, and this acid is so powerful that it will actually burn its way through a shell. Because this calcium, this is only calcium, and if you put acid of very, very weak, just vinegar, on a seashell, it will fizz because it's eating into the seashell. So it doesn't need a very strong acid, even vinegar, and obviously the acid from the body of this sea urchin landing on here. And what he would do, he'd drill a hole using his body acid to drill through into this creature and eat it. I mean, this one's quite high up, so I don't know how long it takes for him to drill through. But I should think by the time he drilled through into the creature had moved on and it was right down here. So I'm not sure that he managed to kill the animal. I mean, it may not be that that was what actually happened, but maybe the thing that killed this creature was actually a sea urchin drilling his way in. Now, I've got some bigger ones of those. This is a fossilized one, and this is probably millions of years old. This is a fossilized taratella, and it's much bigger. Everything was much bigger back in the day. And this is a huge fossilized one, and it must have been really big when it was whole. I mean, this is the casing of the inside. This is actually inside of the taratella, and the outside, the actual shell, has turned to stone, but it's disappeared, and it's cracked off and broken away, so you can't actually see it. Now, when you're poking around in the sea looking for shells, fossilized shells in limestone, because limestone is made up of fossilized shells of creatures that have died, and it's calcium. And you find another one. There's another shell which totally turned to stone, and again it might be an internal casting, I'm not quite sure, of the shell itself. The shell's disappeared, but the casting looks like the real thing, and you can see it there and recognize it as a shell. Now, another thing you get when you're dealing with fossils are these things. Look like bullets. And I've got a whole box of them here. Now, these aren't shells. These are the internal structure, a bit like that cuttlefish that I was talking about. These are the body parts of a squid kind of creature, which they call a belemnite. Now, they look like bullets. So when you find them out in the countryside or in the sea, they look very much like bullets, but they're not bullets, I can assure you that. They're actually belemnites, which are creatures. Now, another thing you see is in sediments is things like this. Now, this actually might be a coprolite, because it looks as if, and coprolites are of poo, if you like. Coprolites of poo, and I don't know where I picked this up quite from, but it was out of a quarry, and it looks strange. But if you look in there, you can see that there's a seashell actually inside it. So this might be the excreted from some other sea creature, and a shell is dug into it, and it's been fossilized. So now it's turned into stone, but that was almost certainly some sort of copperite, I would imagine. Now, another thing you get in sandstone rocks are very old sandstone rocks. This is sandstone from the bottom of the sea, and when you crack them open, this is a solid piece of rock, and I dug it out and I cut it, I split it, hit it on the side and split it. And when you split things through, you very often find something inside, if you're lucky. Now, inside there is a little creature called a trilobite, and you can see the head there of the trilobite, and there's also a little seashell alongside it, which shows you that this creature was once at the bottom of the sea. And so these trilobites come from out of the sea as well, and sometimes you can find them in the sediments of the bottom of the sea. Now, another thing I got here, I don't know what this is, I can't remember. This is a strange one. This is another rock which is fits together, and again I cracked it open, and inside there's a very strange thing. Now, I'm not quite sure what this is. Now, it might be some kind of coral. It might be some sort of what was those other things that we were looking at? A sponge. It might be some sort of sponge, but it's very strange, and I'm not 100% sure what it is. So if you're looking at this video and you're a bit of a paleontologist or a fossil collector like I am, and you know exactly what that is, if you can see it. My lighting is never very good, but if I try and turn the light round, whether that's going to improve. But it's just a flat disc, and it looks very strange, and I'm not, totally sure what that actually is. But it's very interesting, and if you recognize it, or can tell me what it is, I'd be very interested. So that was discovered inside a piece of rock. There's a piece of rock. I cracked it open, and that was inside it. So that's very interesting. Now, I think, there's two more. This is a type of sea creature, and I can't offhand remember the name of this one either. I should have done, as usual, I should have done a little bit more research. I never research things properly and I forget things, and I should always make notes, and it would make these videos a little bit better. But I do try, and this is another strange sort of creature which I picked up from a shop somewhere, and it's a sort of a cross between an ammonite and a seashell and a goniatite. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's a very strange sort of creature. And this one, which everybody knows about, which has got a door on it, and they refer to these as devil's toenails. And it's what they call a gryphea, which is a kind of shell that grows like this, and they hang on the rock, I think, like that, and they sucker themselves to a rock, and then this little door here opens and closes, and the creature comes out and feeds on whatever's passing by. So those are my rocks and fossils of seashells that I've got, and very interesting they are too. So I hope you enjoyed looking at that. And it's, as I say, it's a little follow-up video, but it's gone on for 21 minutes already, so it's longer than I thought it was going to be. So as usual, Grandad's saying it's time to go, and don't forget to subscribe and like my videos if you do, and hit that bell so you get notified of any upcoming videos that I'm going to be doing. I'm hoping to find something more interesting, or as interesting. Maybe you find this really interesting. I hope so, because that's why I do it. And when I find something else, I'll be back to see you. So until that day, I'll say goodbye now. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.